We're really good at burying things. Most of the things that we bury are dead. In fact, as it turns out, most of the things that we bury that are dead are ourselves. There are those of you in this room who knows what it means to bury a parent or grandparent. There's some in this room who know what it means to bury a friend or a spouse. And there's some in this room who know what it means to do the unthinkable, and that's to bury a child. An act that, in the words of King Theoden in Peter Jackson's version of The Lord of the Rings, who said, "No parent should have to bury their child." But as it turns out as well, we think then that because we have buried so many things that are dead, we assume that anytime we bury anything, that it's also dead. And as it turns out, there are a lot of things that we bury alive. We bury our trauma. We bury our grief. We bury our sadness. We bury our disappointment. We bury the things that we're afraid of but can't name. We bury the parts of our hearts that are sad. We bury the parts of our marriage that we think are not going to make it. We bury the parts of our parenting that are just taking way too long. And along with all those painful things that we bury our imaginations. We bury our longings, and we bury our hope, because we're good at burying things. And along with these things, we have pictures from the very scriptures themselves that will come to our doorstep and remind us that we aren't the only people who bury things alive. The woman with a bleeding dyscrasia in Mark 5, who comes to Jesus hoping that she could have a commando healing experience. I'll get in, get the job done, and get out, and not be noticed. She thought that there was a part of her that was still living, her bleeding, that she could be saved, but there was other part of her life that she did not want to be seen, that had already been buried. The part of her that still had to live with the shame and the guilt of what it meant to be a woman who had this kind of a physical problem. And what about our friend, the man who was nameless in John 9, who, though he was alive, sitting by the side of the road somewhere, alive enough that Jesus and the disciples noticed him, alive enough that they would heal him, and yet so much of his life was already buried. I will tell us that we each have significant acreage of our lives that, even without knowing it, we've buried. But then Jesus comes along. And when he comes, he has a very different take on death. When he encounters death, I want to assure you, burial is not what he sees. He comes to the widow of Nain, who has a boy who is dead, and Jesus gives him back to her. He comes to Jairus' daughter, who everybody else thinks is dead, and he imagines that all she's doing is sleeping. He comes to Lazarus, and this dude was seriously dead. He was aromatically dead. We were told, don't open the cave. It's not gonna be good. And Jesus, what he sees is not burial. He sees, get this guy some real clothes. This was a man who lived among us and began to imagine things waiting for our imaginations to catch up. He looked at death, at all of the shattered trauma, and he did not see burial. He saw something else. And he didn't just come to those people who were obviously dead. He came to people like our woman in Mark 5. You know, we all have ways in which we package and wrap our lives, our traumas, such that there will be certain things that we can tolerate and we can allow that to be seen, and there will be other things that we will make sure that nobody ever touches. In fact, we're so good at this that we don't even know we're doing it most of the time. And we come to conferences like this and we want to be encouraged and nourished and nurtured, and so it will be. And when we do, we may leave while there are things about our lives that we left hidden we didn't even know we were hiding. And Jesus is having none of this. Because when Jesus looks at the things that we believe are dead, burial is not what he sees. He comes to the woman in Mark 5, and when she thinks that she's going to get away with her act of healing, he has another plan in mind. She thinks all she's going to do is to touch the bottom of his robe, and then she will be fine. And he stops the parade, and she thinks, crap. She actually thought a different word, but I'm not allowed to say that here. Because can you imagine, for her, who has suffered at the hand of many healers, how many of us are really aware that even in our attempt to be helpful, there have just been way too many ways in which we haven't been? I gotta tell, I've been in practice for 30 years. And if people were to say well, do you think you're any good at what you do? I would say, I hope people would say that I'm mostly helpful most of the time for most people. Do you know how many people that leaves out? A lot. But fortunately, they've all paid me, so it still works. She has suffered at the hands of many healing, but it's not just many healers at the hand of whom she suffered. She suffered at the hands of her community, because this would be a woman who would not know what it means likely to have been married, would not know what it means likely to have had children, would not know what it means to be honored as a daughter whom he calls her. We all have parts of us who long to be called sons and daughters of God. Parts of us that are waiting in the wings, some of those parts hiding forever. And Jesus does not see burial. With the man in John 9, Jesus comes for him. This guy doesn't even ask for healing. He's just minding his own blind business, standing by the side of the road. And the next thing you know, mud is being slapped on his face. If I'm him, I didn't ask for this. I showered already this morning. But before it's applied, what do the disciples say? Who sinned? They are already looking for the pathology. They are looking for a way to blame who they need to blame so we can then fix this problem and move on. And Jesus is saying, this is the wrong question. You all look at burial, and I see something else coming. And so even for those parts of us that we have buried alive, when Jesus comes to the parts that we feel that are dead, life is what he sees. He sees beauty coming in the heels of trauma. Jesus does not think of death and then think burial. Jesus sees death and he thinks planting. Jesus looks at this whole enterprise as one big opportunity for this vast garden of beauty and goodness to emerge. And it all began with his planting in Eden. What we thought was the end of the world, what Adam and Eve thought was the end of the world, because when God comes walking in the afternoon, they figure he's coming to kill them. And he didn't. He came to plant something, even in that space. Jesus is coming to plant, and for the most part, I like this idea. I grew up in eastern Ohio, and we had about 1.5 acre garden. And every spring, my dad and I would go out, and I would have to help him plant sweet corn. And there would be like 1/2 acre of rows of sweet corn. Do you know what it's like to be 8 years old and planting sweet corn with your dad? No, it's not fun. Okay, I just tell you. But the harvest that came in August was unbelievable. Because my father, when he planted, saw something coming. Now, generally, I like this idea, but I have to say, I would much rather Jesus plant things on my terms. Seriously, right? Like, I would love for things to be planted and then harvested like the next day. But just like our woman with the bleeding problem and our man with the blindness, their lives were healed, and then you figure all the wheels start to come off. Our blind man was healed of his blindness, and then what happened? He gets eventually pushed out of the community. Part of why I want healing to happen quickly is because I know how hard it is for healing to happen. How many of us here have been planting for years? And we are waiting for harvest. In fact, we would love for the resurrection to happen now. We would love for the harvest to happen now. And I want to assure you, just like Jesus did for our man who was blind, when he heard that they had put him out of the community, Jesus came to find him. Here's my question. Who are the people who are coming to find the parts of us who can see that though we have buried them, they see a harvest that's coming? Because if we don't have someone coming for us, we eventually will be unable to give that which we do not have. Jesus is the one who looks at grave sites and does not think death, does not imagine burial. He imagines planting and a harvest that is coming. What is happening here at CAFO is the beginning of that harvest. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. The great planter and the great harvester is with us, is at work, and he will complete the planting that he has begun. Thanks be to God.